Hello, I'm Mike, and today I'm going to go over chapter 3 of Kotter's book, Leading Change. This is a business book that talks about a change management model, which involves 8 steps. In chapter 3, Kotter mentions the first step, which is establish a sense of urgency. He says that urgency is crucial when starting a new operation, and especially because complacency within the organization is higher. If people don't feel this sense of urgency, they'll find a lot of ways to ignore or even be resistant to this change, or think that this change might not be the right thing to do right now. And it can seem illogical. Complacency can come from a number of sources. I'll read a few of the sources, but I'll leave the rest for you to check out once you read the book yourself. Low overall performance standards. Too many visible resources. There's not too many fires we need to put out right now. The absence of a major and visible crisis. A lack of performance feedback, not knowing what's really going on in the business environment. What are those things that we need to work on? Otherwise, we start going downhill 5 years from now. A lot of sources which might cause complacency. We might give our attention to a narrow set of goals instead of focusing on the long-term goals. And whenever these internal control systems, which are managed, whenever these systems are strong and very rigid, it can be difficult to state that there's a need for change. As long as a certain percentage of goals have been met for this period of time, people might not see a need for making any changes immediately. Another reason for complacency is doing what I need to do to get by now. I've always felt safe in this position. I've always managed safely without having to make any major changes, and keep on doing things this way will allow me to perhaps move on to another position or move towards retirement. And this complacency can let a false sense of urgency, a false sense of security rather, settle in. And this can become an ego problem within the culture, where people think that, I don't need to do anything. There's nothing that really needs to be changed. Kotter writes, never underestimate the magnitude of the forces that reinforce complacency and that help maintain the status quo. So there might be a couple discussions on the committee level, but the newsletter that goes out to employees says, oh yeah, everything is going great. We're meeting our standards. And sometimes it takes some bold action in order to create a sense of urgency whenever there's a complacency like this. Bold, as Kotter mentions, means making the balance sheet show the reality of the situation. Changing the location, not having a corporate office that looks like it's a luxury place and that's totally out of touch with the workers who are in the plants or in the corporate offices. Considering a new pay issue, making 50% of pay for the top 10 officers based on tough product quality targets for the whole organization. That's a quote from Kotter. Perhaps instead of hiring external consultants, you might actually meet with your own leadership and figure out what it is that really face-to-face that we need to work on. Kotter mentions a few ways to raise urgency level whenever there's complacency, And one of those ways, he mentions nine ways here. One of those ways is to send more data about customer satisfaction and financial performance to more employees, especially information that demonstrates weaknesses. The reason why he mentions that is because someone working within their own office, within their own department, they may never have any interaction with the customer. They may not know, what is it that we need to change? I'm just working on this process here. Or perhaps even worse, leadership being in a position where they're never even in touch with their employees or the customer. And so they don't really know what's going on. So for someone who's been rewarded, as Kotter mentions, for being very cautious in their management approach and for always avoiding too much risk, then maybe complacency is the answer. What about a crisis? It's very easy, as Kotter mentioned, to see when there's an economic crisis. There's a shortage in resources. But it's much more difficult to know whether there are any external factors in the environment which will affect the organization in the long term. Unless we look at the data, unless we discuss it. Kotter did say that some leaders might actually create an artificial crisis rather than waiting for something to happen. So they might actually make a crisis-like situation where there's no immediate crisis, but acting as though there is something that needs to be addressed right now. And that way people's attention are brought to that issue. He writes that the role of middle and lower level managers, they need to develop a unity with leadership and be able to sell that vision so that there's enough autonomy within the groups that they work with that they can work through the process and move towards change. The alternative, as he mentions, is to do nothing. Just let the inertia of the complacency settle in. And even though we say we want change, but let's just sit back and let somebody else do it. So senior executives are needed to be the key players in reducing these forces of complacency, this inertia which moves things towards not a pointed direction of change. So if we have senior management that's very cautious, they always want to meet the status quo, that's always going to fail in the long run whenever there's change that's needed. How much urgency is enough? There needs to be a majority, at least 75, 80% perhaps. And when that pressure on the complacency reaches a certain point, then we can perhaps see some transformation begin. And there can be a process where we move to the next step, which is create a guiding coalition. So maybe not everybody in the organization agrees, but definitely most of the people in the organization, and especially the people involved who need to make that change happen. They need to be on board and realize that there is a sense of urgency. Some might say, oh yeah, everything's fine. We're ready for this change. Everyone understands what needs to be done. And we're just going to move ahead and try to implement this change. But that's going to backfire because in reality, if we were to get in touch with those individual team members in the organization, we find out that they don't realize the sense of urgency. They don't know what the issue is. So Kotter mentions at the end of this third chapter that one way to find out, to gauge whether there is a sense of urgency, is to actually go talk with people, talk with stakeholders, maybe even talk with competitors, find out what their perspective is, get an idea of where your organization stands. Before we say, I'm just going to implement this change, Is there, first and foremost, a sense of urgency?